All right, everybody, can you hear me? What's the online sound level like? Yeah? Okay. Well, thank you everybody for coming today. The last time I chaired one of these public lectures in person was way back in 2020 before COVID struck. We had a full room. We had 100 people in here. But such a changed time. It's lovely to see you all here. But also to welcome all our viewers online, and of which there are a great many. And that's been one of the great successes that we've found during COVID. One of the silver linings is that we now have many, many more people looking at our lectures live and on recording as well on YouTube. So we're reaching hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people with every lecture. So welcome all of you who are watching live. The Society was founded in 1707. We are the oldest learned society concerned with the care and research of the past, the remains of the past. And we've been in this wonderful building at Burlington House since 1874, when it was built for us by the government. And as you were probably aware, you may be aware, we've been fighting a campaign for the last 10 years to persuade this current government and its predecessors to allow us to stay here. And that is an ongoing battle. Anyway, my name is John Lewis. I'm the General Secretary of the Society, so I'm the Chief Executive of the charity. And a little bit of housekeeping first. As I said, this is a hybrid event. We're delighted to welcome so many of you online, and it's heartening to see so many here in person. There will be a question and answer session at the end, and we will be taking questions from the room and also on Zoom and YouTube. If anyone would like to ask a question online, please type in the chat function on Zoom or YouTube, and then I'll ask as many to be read out at the end as I can. Those of you in the room, just simply raise your hand physically, and we'll come round to you. We'll pass a microphone round. Please speak into the microphone, because otherwise people on online won't hear what you've got to say. Okay, won't hear your question. There is no fire alarm drill scheduled for today. So if the alarm goes off, please go through that door, turn right out into the courtyard, and we all congregate around the statue of Sir Joshua Reynolds to be processed out there. So if it goes off, please just go out and get out to Sir Joshua. Today's lecture, Creating an Impression, Rebellion, Revolution, Reform by Jasper Jennings. Jasper spent over 20 years finding and selling antiquarian prints. He has combined his working knowledge and robust historical scholarship and engages diverse audiences with print culture and art. We have actually some great material here in these categories as well in our library. He joined a shop selling rare prints and books in Covent Garden straight out of university. And after a brief spell in the New York Gallery, Jasper started dealing himself. He's written on the market in printed collectibles for titles such as Historic House and the Antiques Trade Gazette. And so promises to be a fascinating lecture today. Jasper's going to examine 6 surviving fragments from our visual heritage in detail, and he'll reveal the histories behind the inception, printing, utility, and iconography of these 6 antiquarian prints. And all 6 examples have passed through Jasper's hands when he was a dealer in these things. And these all come from the long 18th century, don't they? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So from the Glorious Revolution through to the Great Reform Act of 1832. So I won't say any more about that. I'll hand over to Jasper, and I'm really looking forward to your talk. Jasper.
Thank you very much, John. And my thanks to Danielle and Rebecca in the Events and Communications team for giving me the opportunity to speak to this very prestigious learned society in its glorious headquarters here at Burlington House. As John said, I will be examining 6 antique prints in detail, chronologically, and attempting to weave a coherent political and cultural narrative between them. These were all prints I found during my time as a dealer in such things, as he said. So I'm using my own scans of my own sold stock, complemented by slides showing holdings from major collections. So what these images, or more correctly, combinations of text and image have in common is that they were printed on blocks, stones, and plates. Yes. Sorry, I should have said that. Assumed it would be. Thank you. Sorry for the brief technical interruption. Anyway, yes, so they were all printed from blocks, stones, and plates, worked by hand in a variety of processes, and printed in a press onto paper. And I'm sure the more astute among you would have noticed immediately the pun on the word impression in the title. Of course, an impression refers to one printing from said matrix, be it block, stone, or copper plate. And I suppose I've chosen this title to really emphasize the fact that these are not simply documentary records of events or passive monuments, but active vehicles for the exchange of ideas and information, and in a sense, participants, if inanimate objects can be participants, as well as witnesses to our history. So the first print we're looking at is an engraving produced somewhere in Germany, we're not sure where, showing the infant Prince James Francis Edward Stuart, who would become known to posterity as the Old Pretender. The lady on the right, rocking the cradle, is Mary of Modena, Queen to the Catholic King, James II, who I'm sure I don't need to tell you all was overthrown a few months later at the end of 1688, when the birth of this male heir led Parliament to invite his Protestant daughter Mary and her husband William of Orange to invade from Holland. So this is, in effect, I believe, acting as pro-Stuart, or in other words, Jacobite propaganda. It couldn't be printed lawfully in England at this time because this sort of imagery extolling the legitimacy of the Stuart line, which this print does, by the way, in the German lettering, the young Prince of Wales, extolling the virtues of the Stuart line was illegal at this time in England and Scotland and across Britain. So it's produced anonymously on the continent. We've got a lot of symbolism in there. We've got the bonnet of the young princeling is decorated with the feathers of the Prince of Wales. You could probably see. And we've got the roses and thistles. You'll notice the combination. He's looking at a sort of vase full of flowers, partly out of frame, and that is a combination, a highly symbolic combination of roses and thistles, obviously indicating the union of the crowns of England and Scotland, suggesting that the whole of Britain, that he's rightful monarch to be of the whole of Britain. It seems to be a copy in reverse of what a sort of semi-official print, this time in Mezzotint, appearing lower right, which was printed by Edward Cooper in London shortly after the birth, which was in the summer of 1688, June 1688, I believe. I say semi-official because Cooper was granted a royal license, which amounted to a copyright for the term of 14 years. It says it's hard to read, you won't be able to necessarily see it, but it does say cum privilegio regis below the title there. So yeah, it's a small print. Both are quite small, similar dimensions actually. So perhaps it's not the sort of thing you'd want to, if you were a sympathizer with the Jacobites, sort of display, but you might want to keep it safely tucked in a book or in a folio, or possibly pasted under a lid of a caddy or a box, possibly, or somewhere, out of the way. This is the other side, propaganda for the other side, pro-Williamite Protestant propaganda, which is casting doubt on the legitimacy of the young Prince James. The rather sinister figure entering stage left to caress the Queen is the Jesuit father, Edward Peter, her confessor. And there was a rumor that he might be the father of the child. An alternative rumor was that the baby was not Mary's, but the son of a miller's wife, and which had been substituted in the sort of bedpan controversy you may know about. So we've got here, for example, a little windmill. I don't know if you can see it there, tucked in the blankets there. This is a print that's in the British Museum collection. As you can see, I did have an impression of this print in my stock at one time. Like this example, it is a reissue of a plate. It's a 1797 reissue of a plate first published at about 1750, right in the middle of the 18th century. But I didn't take for some reason, I didn't take a very good picture of my actual example, so this will suffice. Anyway, this is showing Westminster Hall, the famous hammer beam roof, which for much of the middle of the 18th century was also a sort of upmarket shopping mall, I suppose, with booths for rental, where books and stationery, trinkets, wares of seamstresses were sold from stalls, while in fact legal cases were being heard, because it was also the centre of various courts. And prints would also have been sold. You can see, in fact, someone is selling prints, it looks like, over there. Prints probably quite similar to this, in fact, because it is a satire on the legal profession, the sort of doggerel satirical verse in 4 columns below the image, sort of lambasting the venality of lawyers and the profession and their sort of overblown rhetoric. So it's just to show, this is really illustrating London in the middle of the 18th century by a Parisian. It was designed by a Parisian who went under the sort of nom de plume Gravelot, and it's showing lots of things that people wanted to see and be seen in a centre of commerce, right in the heart of the political and judicial establishment. And the people would sort of enjoy it. It was sort of entertainment. The courts were almost entertainment. People would have liked watching the lawyers declaim on the case of some poor unfortunate. The second print I want to examine in a bit more detail is an extraordinary trade card size design produced for a museum of waxwork figures, which operated in Paris in the 1780s. It's got French and English lettering, part of Aubyn's cabinet, as you can see, which suggests it was probably appealing to an international, predominantly English-speaking tourist market. And it was probably sold with souvenirs for visitors, with perhaps small wax models, smaller versions of what was actually on display. So it's a sort of Madame Tussauds of the time, and you can see that there's a very elaborate garlanded frame surrounding a grotte chinoise, a sort of Chinese pagoda, which was presumably perhaps one of the structures that people could see when they went to this show. there was a fashion for chinoiserie at the time. But anyway, more important to us is these bits of body parts and bust portraits, which you can see within that frame. It's a sort of rogues gallery of notorious characters from what was very recent history and almost contemporary events at the time. So it's not, perhaps not an overtly political print, but it does show one aspect of popular engagement with politics in the broadest sense. Politics is sort of entertainment, and entertainment of happening contemporaneously. So we've got, let's have a look at who we've got. We've got left and right, the severed heads and hands of two disgraced statesmen from the court of King of Christian VII of Denmark. There's a man called Enevold Brandt, and one's called Johann Friedrich Struensee, who were involved in a sort of coup at the court of Christian, who, in an interesting parallel perhaps with George III, who had bouts of what was presumed to be insanity. And it was rumoured that Struensee and the king's wife, who was Caroline Matilda of Britain, were rumoured to be lovers. And in 1772, Struensee and Brandt were condemned to lose their right hands and then to be beheaded. So you can see Brandt there, the unfortunate Brandt, opposite Struensee's head, his hand below. I haven't identified the European male monarch. Someone Rex, perhaps? I mean, if anyone's got any ideas, look, might be interested to know, actually. We've got, I think we're looking at Catherine the Great of Russia surmounting on the oval at the very top there of the frame. And I think, and this chap we know, partly because it says, is Yemelyan Pugachev, who led the Cossacks' rebellion against Catherine in Russia. So I found this at, I think it was just at a big antiques fair. There was there's a chap who sort of deals in what's called ephemera, and in the bottom of one of his boxes, I found this very inexpensively, and I'm pleased to say sold it to the V&A, where you can see it online in their collection. So pleased with that. Good find. This is not from my stock, but this is just on the theme of sort of waxworks. Philip Curtius, who was the sort of who sort of taught Madame Tussauds. He sort of trained young Anna Maria Tussaud. This is an advert for his show that toured around Britain. So it's to be seen in an elegant large room opposite Bissett's Museum, New Street, Birmingham. You've got this handbill. The glass ship is illustrated in a wood engraved vignette, and you may, and he was also exhibiting heads of what we might call political figures. The head of Monsieur Delaunay was, of course, governor of the Bastille prison in Paris, who was dragged out by the mob and didn't last much longer than that. So again, we've sort of got here the Georgian pursuit of novelty, of ghoulish entertainment, perhaps you might say. Third print I want to look at in a bit of depth. I think I found at an auction in Holland, if I can remember, this was some years back. So we are now going forward still further into the time of the American Revolution. And this purports to show, this image, the arrival of a ship carrying the young Prince William Henry, who was to be the future King William IV, into New York on the 16th of October, 1781, where the 16-year-old prince served as a naval officer during the American Revolution, or War of Independence, as they would say over there. And some of you might know that there was a George Washington actually approved a kidnap plot on the young prince while he was in New York, which didn't get anywhere, but there was talk of that, of being holding him to ransom. So I bought this because I thought it was an interesting example of a depiction of an episode in America by someone who clearly never been to America, I'd assumed. It's published in Germany in Augsburg, I believe. But in fact, we will see it has nothing to do with events in America. There's the full sheet, same print, showing the full margins, and you could see perhaps on the left there, the remains of some stitching holes. It was bound with, it would have been bound at one point, with a collection of what were called vues d'optique, these optical views, which explains why you might, the lettering across the top there, and French lettering notice. So again, we're appealing to an international sort of European elite, I suppose, sort of audience. That's in reverse because these sort of prints were intended to be viewed through a device called a zogroscope, sort of optical viewer. Get rid of that ink. Yeah. So this was, a zogroscope was a viewer mounted on a pedestal showing the mirror reflection of a print through a convex magnifying lens. So the Georgians loved their optical entertainments. You may know they like their magic lantern shows, as they're called. They liked their various cameras for drawing outlines and producing perspective. So this is part of that tradition, really. But this is another German copy of a British print, The Fishery, by William Woollett after the Liverpool marine artist Richard Wright, which was published first in London in 1768. So at least sort of 10 to 15 years before my print. So you can see it's basically the same image, there are alterations in reverse again. And by the way, these copies tend to be in reverse because the original design was traced first and then engraved from a tracing outline. So obviously when the copy was then put through the press, it appeared as in reverse to the original, the image from which it is copying. That makes sense. So The Fishery, nothing to do with North America. The title comes from the beached boats in the foreground, bringing in the catch. And in fact, this ship is identified as HMS Neptune. Nothing to do with the ship that the young Prince William Henry was on. Woollett was one of the first English engravers to gain a following amongst print collectors on the continent. So Germans would have known this image. Educated Germans who were into their art would have known this image only through Woolett's engraving. And it was he, not the painter Wright, who owned the copyright as owner of the engraved plate. We will find out soon with another print I've got lined up that German journals regularly reviewed new English prints, and there was a lively trade across the channel with the German port cities and into Germany itself, into the German hinterland. The Morning Chronicle of May 1785 had this to say about Woolett's prints. They have been the means of raising the reputation of English engravings abroad, so that a balance of £30,000 annually in favour of this kingdom hath for many years arisen from the exportation of our prints in general. So it's a time of general popularity of British prints, and there was a following for particular engravers like Woollett, who was known for his skill with the burin. In fact, he called himself an engraver, but it's mostly etching. There is some of the detail is engraved, but the outline and a lot of the work is done by etching. Some of you probably know engraving is done with a tool called a burin or burin on directly by scratching grooves directly on a copper plate. Etching, the design is sort of almost drawn with a needle through a waxy resin ground, and then that ground with the plate is immersed in acid, and the design is bitten into the plate. So yeah, it's an interesting example, and there's a sort of slightly strange, sort of almost hearse-like carriage, sort of on its way down to the foreshore. You'll see in the lower right there, which you'll see is lettered fish machine. Hopefully you can see is lettered fish machine, which was, I think, referring to a prize offered by the Society of Arts, or the full title is Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures and Commerce, still down in Adelphi to this day. So it was a prize for a commercial scheme for supplying London with fresh fish. I think the idea was they'd be caught, still be alive and swimming around in tanks inside there. But anyway, and in fact, this Wright's painting, in fact, obtained the premium or prize of the Society of Arts in 1764 for the best sea view. The Society of Arts being the first organisation to publicly exhibit domestic art on a large scale, before our neighbours here at the Royal Academy, before that was brought into being, in fact, and founded. And that's, there's the fishermen landing their catch from my German print. And just to show you that recycling of imagery among printers and publishers was going on all the time. Here's just an example. Here's a Lincolnshire fishmonger has used that image. He's copied it in reverse of that. That's clearly inspired by the image created by Wright and Willett. Again, this Willett's print would have been known, obviously, widely available in England. So he's just borrowed that image for his trade card. So yeah, so when I did this research, and I'm pleased to say that it was actually incorporated by the National Maritime Museum, because they hadn't made that connection with between the German image and the fishery print. So that was pleasing. So, in fact, we've got another German copy here of a British print. Number 4, again from my sold stock. This is more obviously a satirical print. We saw one earlier, but this is from the heyday of satire, single sheet satire, when the image started to completely dominate the text. And this would have been published in the then Dukedom of Weimar, one of the very small British, German states and principalities that then existed before the unification. And Weimar was a very important cultural centre of Europe, which had been home to literary figures like Goethe, Schiller, Herder. And this is an illustration. You can probably tell from you can probably see the 2 vertical folds. It was folded and was sold with the London and Paris journal, which actually specialized in reviews of satire published in Britain, and featured very faithful but slightly reduced reproductions. This, I suppose this print speaks to the anxieties of a rather fraught relationship at the heart of the British Empire at the time between its 2 principal islands, the island of Ireland and the island of Britain. Because the Irish Rebellion, the United Irishmen, that happened in 1798, the year before. And Prime Minister William Pitt, who is seen here driving a 2-wheeled sort of carriage, come chariot, he was pushing for the union of the parliaments of Great Britain and Ireland, which happened, I think it was eventually in 1801 or 2. So he's sort of driving these 2 bulls. We've got John Bull at the front representing Britain. We've got PB Paddy Bull behind him representing Ireland, who, as you can see, is playing up and not wanting to push on towards Windsor Castle, which is very faintly delineated actually in the lower left there in outline, etched in outline. So this is the print. In fact, it is copied from this single sheet cartoon published by Fours in London in February of, so a bit earlier in the same year, 1799. That's an impression from the British Museum, as you can see. So it's a very faithful copy. And Pitt was, I think Pitt was holding out the carrot of Catholic emancipation to the Irish to try and garner support for the Union, which ultimately failed. The king exercised his royal prerogative. He wouldn't have Catholic emancipation, which would mean obviously that Catholics could stand for Parliament. They could already vote in Ireland, if provided they met certain property qualifications. But anyway, the king was opposed, so it all fell apart, and that's why Pitt resigned. He did come back a couple of years later, but to become prime minister again. But that's why that ended his first administration. So that's an etching, which is, as I sort of hinted at before, quite a more delicate, fluid, and spontaneous medium than engraving. You can almost effectively draw through this waxy coated resin with your needle, and it's faster to produce, so you can respond to current affairs more quickly than with engraving. So, peace came between France and the Sixth Coalition at the Treaty of Paris in May 1814. Now, history knows now that that wasn't a peace that was to last very long, because Napoleon made his 100 days comeback in 1815, of course, and culminating in Waterloo. But this was a peace, temple of concord, a temple of peace, a sort of temporary structure, absolutely packed with explosive gunpowder fireworks for the celebration of the peace, which was held on the 1st of August, 1814, under the direction of the Prince of Wales, the future George IV, who had stepped in to become regent due to the incapacity of his father. He wanted to explicitly tie in national celebration with the 100-year centenary celebration of the Hanoverian succession. The Hanoverians, his great-grandfather had come to power in 1714. So he was sort of tying the monarchy to, as I say, to the public, wider public, to the idea of nationhood. This is an aquatint, hand-colored, designed by father of Augustus Pugin, the famous Gothic architect. This is his father, Augustus Charles Pugin. So again, you've got a pagoda, you've got lots of display, you've got public occasion that the Georgians love. Published about 12 days after the actual event, as you can see, published on August 12th. So Waterloo came for Napoleon, and then it came for the magistrates of Manchester in August 1819, when a mass meeting agitating for constitutional reform and extension of the franchise at St. Peter's Fields was broken up by the local militia with the aid of a company of hussars. And little people know about this. It left, I think it was about 15 people dead, a lot of people injured, widely regarded as a total overreaction by the authorities. This is an etching by John Slack, who was a Manchester engraver and printer, and may have been there, may have been in the crowd. It's a fairly small sheet, as you can see from my dimensions. So again, it's not for display. It's probably not something you want to shout about if you have bought this print, because if you've bought this print, you're almost certainly a sympathizer with the reformers' cause. And it seems clear to me that Slack is also a sympathizer from this depiction. It is lettered, a cabinet picture drawn and etched by J. Slack, Manchester, for private use. Yeah, so it's, no, it doesn't say for private use. It says, this is a cabinet picture. Yeah, so it's again, it's a sort of small thing you might want to hide away in your folio of prints and bring out for sympathetic friends when you want to discuss the tragic events. Again, perhaps it might have been pasted, impressions may have been pasted on the lids of boxes in the back verse of frames, possibly, that's a speculation. But if we zoom in, we will see a little better there that the, there go the yeomanry, or the hussars probably, that's, they look more like regular army men in the uniforms there. Sabres slashing away at the crowd, surrounding the speakers. On the podium, you can see perhaps one of the placards is rather pointedly lettered order, maybe held by one of the representatives of the many female reform groups that were formed in the Northwest at this time. So we've got a respectably dressed crowd, haven't we? They've all got nice top hats, they're well dressed. There's a lot of women in the crowd. So it's very respectable, almost innocent, don't they? And it's kind of a dramatic illustration. Slack was always also responsible for this much larger engraving on it's a sort of banner-sized engraving and may have been used perhaps as a banner at subsequent demonstrations and meetings, perhaps. I speculate. But this is in the British Museum again. It's a similar image, similar perspective, showing the square and certain similar buildings, actually, but it's not quite the same. But I would like to have, I would love to have found that one, but I found the little print, which was very pleasing to me, at a book fair. Here's George Cruikshank, the famous satirist and cartoonist's take on events of that fateful day, where sort of the sort of faux patriotic credentials of the yeomanry are mocked. They've got the butcher's sleeves. They're hacking away at a rather more, I suppose, demotic looking group of spectators. I don't know. Down with them, chop them down. Someone shouts, "My brave boys, give them no quarter. They want to take our beef and pudding from us." Patriotic symbols of Britishness. Remember, the more you kill, the less poor rates you'll have to pay. So go to it, lad, show your courage and your loyalty. So here we see that notions of patriotism are bound up at this time with debates over political participation. Who are the true inheritors, the heirs of ancient British liberties, defenders of that great uncodified constitution, Magna Carta, the Bill of Rights, all that? Is it the reformers, as people like Slack would no doubt aver, or is it the loyal defenders of the status quo? So I found this funny little, it's German, there's a theme here, I suppose. There's a German print. I found this, I don't even remember where I found this, but it's, I hadn't seen it before. What we know is that the kind of equivalent depiction that we just saw for the Manchester demonstration would not be allowed in Charles X's France. The Bourbon Charles X was deposed after the so-called July Revolution of 1830, which this is depicting, in favor of a constitutional monarchy led by the Duc d'Orléans, Louis Philippe. So here you can see troops in front of the Tuileries Palace in the background, being attacked by the Parisian mob, I guess. Guns and stones, women helping to collect rocks. Someone's hacking down the Bourbon crest at the top right on a step ladder, or ladder. So again, this is at a time in Britain of heightened, a lot of agitation and quite a lot of demonstrations and riots in places like Bristol, particularly, and elsewhere, against agitating for reform. We're leading up to the Great Reform Act of a couple of years later, and events in France were carefully noted. this is what happens when a monarch tries to rule sort of absolutely and doesn't concede any reform, is the sort of, I suppose people would argue in Britain, some people argued. Anyway, so I found that, I don't know where it's from, it's just quite a small strip in size. It's A4 in length, if that makes sense, but not as wide. And it was possibly, looks like a fragment from a larger print, or possibly the header to something like a almanac, possibly, don't know. Never seen it before. No one could tell me much about it. But it's an interesting image, I thought. So, in that context of events across the Channel, the Great Reform Act is passed in 1832, as I say. And this print, number 6, this is a hand-coloured lithograph which printed in Canterbury, showing debates for the among candidates for the first Reformed Parliament in December of that year in the rather splendid Guildhall, Canterbury, Kent, which I am now apparently no longer exists. I think the Victorians knocked it down, not sure, but so this was, I found this at a sort of funny little fair at a sports hall somewhere in the Midlands. Saw it in the corner on top of a trestle table. It was framed, and I think the seller was had valued it for the frame, not the print. The nice maple frame. Anyway, I took it out to have it conserved, and while I had it out of the frame, I took this scan. So these people are, some of these crowd here would have been newly enfranchised by the Reform Act. The so-called, perhaps some of them are the so-called £10 householders. Householders who paid a yearly rental of £10 or more, who for the first time were across all the new parliamentary boroughs were enfranchised. Perhaps some of them were freemen of Canterbury who had the vote already. But anyway, I can tell you that the registered electorate for Canterbury for the first Reform Parliament was 1,511 men, and only men. Because of course, well, one thing the Great Reform Act did was actually the first time explicitly specify that men only could vote. Because by the way, there were at least a smattering of women who could vote before 1832, previous elections, because of various rather arcane rights and property holdings, and because their deceased husband had the vote or whatever, or the right to pass it on. Anyway, we've got an eccentric candidate at the centre of this scene, setting out his stall, and he is William Courtenay, he styled himself. In fact, his name was Nicholas Thom, who stood as a radical independent candidate for the parliamentary borough of Canterbury, and would later spend 3 years in a Kent lunatic asylum, when, following his release, he was killed with several supporters in a confrontation with soldiers in Bossenden Wood, apparently. And he polled quite a creditable 375 votes, which absolutely disgusted the successful Whig candidate, apparently, Richard Watson. There were two Whigs. Canterbury had two members of Parliament up till 1880s, I think. So Richard Watson and George Augustus Frederick Cowper, Viscount Fordwich, were returned to Canterbury, but Watson refused to stand again in 1835 because he was so disappointed with the 375 votes given to his character. So again, these are sort of respectable people. They've got nice hats. I keep mentioning hats because that was one of the big signifiers of the day of respectability in your dress and comportment. We're reminded of Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington's comment upon seeing the first Reform Parliament in the Chamber, Westminster. I never saw so many shocking bad hats in my life. He commented as he poked his head through those great double doors, a small crack in the doors. So, what conclusions can we draw from this exhibition of prints? So one thing they're showing that politics is coming out of, is no longer in the course of this long 18th century is no longer the preserve of elites, closeted elites. It's coming into the public domain. It's becoming part of the public conversation. It's partly mass entertainment. The maverick candidate we've seen for Canterbury. We've seen the Waxworks of people who unfortunately were on the wrong side of political upheavals and lost their heads. We've seen satirical commentary on domestic politics and Irish politics. We've seen prints for foreign consumption and British consumption and vice versa, a lively trade going back and forth across the channel. We've seen an image supposedly from America where no one ever got to, and no one who saw that print was going to go to America, so presumably printmaker didn't care what it looked like. So we've seen the evidence of a growing consumer society willing to pay for goods, services, and experiences. With more leisure time. We've seen more as literacy's grown, we've seen increased visual sophistication over those 140 years, odd years, I would argue. We've seen the prints, some of these prints are tools of propaganda and political solidarity, you might say. Look at the Jacobite portrait at the start and the souvenir of Peterloo. All of which is to say, as I always end most of my lectures, to truly understand the society in which we live, the printed picture deserves at least equal study to the printed word. Thank you for listening. Happy to take any questions.
Can you hear me? That's better. Well, that was excellent. That was really excellent. Before I just take some questions, I've written loads of notes about that. And one of the things that struck me was this society was founded in 1707 and then reformed after a bit of a rest in 1717. And we got our Royal Charter in 1751. So we've gone all the way through that period of the Jacobite rebellions and regime change, so to speak. And I once heard a fellow say that one of the reasons why we're not the Royal Society of Antiquaries is in 1751, which is only 6 years after the 1745. We were still hedging our bets as to which royalty we were going to be involved with. But the other thing that struck me, the detail and the importance, I'm glad you said that at the end, of these things as historical records, is Peterloo. And the thought that Slack may have been in the square, and the fact that, as you pointed out, so many people wearing respectable clothes. Because a few years ago, I spent a weekend in Lincoln just when the latest film was made about Peterloo.
Oh yeah.
It was being used, the streets around Lincoln, at the top of the hill up by the castle, were being used as a film set. And all the extras were there, and they're all ragged sort of peasants, you know.
Yeah.
Totally unlike that depiction of the crowd. And that's from somebody, may well have been that. That was fascinating. Anyway, I've rambled on long enough. Has anybody got any questions in the crowd? In the crowd, it's like Peterloo.
Thank you. Jasper, there seem to be some pigments which are more sort of prolific than others. Is it because certain dyes were more expensive making these prints, or were chemical dyes used by then?
No, these are, I'm trying to think. Organic, these are nearly all organic dyes still, the period we're talking about. And some of those which became widely used hadn't been, or were not really being used in Britain at this time, even if they were from coming from a place like Asia and stuff. But I'm trying to think, yeah, well, you raise a good point, because as I hope I've emphasized, that these are basically commercial publications. They're commodities in themselves. I mean, a lot of them show the exchange of commodities, but they are commodities. And the publishers and printers were acutely aware of their costs and minimizing those as much as possible in their profit margins. Because it is quite an expensive business to employ engravers, etchers, lithographers. Paper wasn't cheap in some cases. So they tried to save where they can. I'm not an expert on colour of the period, but yeah, the range, they tried to use as limited range as they could of the palette as they could get away with. So often things that look quite well coloured, you'll find there's only 3 base colours in them. Blue, there's usually a blue, a brown or earth tone, and sometimes a red. But there's usually not more than that involved. Of course, you make use of sometimes there's white highlighting, but sometimes you're leaving exposed areas of the paper to create an impression of white. But it's a good point, and one which I can't answer very intelligently because although I have read a few books on colouring of prints, it's still actually quite a murky area, and a lot of I want to do a bit more research on it, but also you've got to be careful when you're buying. It's a very vexed question in the trade. There are a lot of quite good colourists who use pigments that were around at the time, but they're employed by certain companies to this day to colour quite accurately sometimes from early models, but you've got to be careful what's modern colour and what's not. But generally, I have to be satisfied before I buy something that it is original, or at least substantially original colour. That's why a lot of my stuff is with black and white. Because like most things, quite a lot of things weren't published in colour. You had to pay extra to get it coloured, or you know, tuppence, what was it, penny plain, tuppence coloured, a lot of the street prints. So it's twice as much to get it in colour, and sometimes you'd have it coloured to style. If, you know, you pay in advance to get it coloured at the point of purchase. You see what I mean?
Hello. The print that was in Hyde Park, in the back of it is Westminster Abbey, but then there's like another building to the left of it. And is that the old Parliament Tower, or is that from Lambeth?
Was there a print of Hyde Park? Which one? Yeah.
The Hyde Park one with the peaceful thing?
Oh, yeah, sorry. Where is it?
So Westminster Abbey, and then there's like another tower thing to the left of it, and I was wondering what that is.
Westminster Abbey, yeah, that's obvious. That's just St. Stephen's Church. Don't know offhand.
Okay.
There's
because it's not the new Parliament building yet, because it wasn't built yet.
No. Well, son of Pugin was heavily involved, wasn't he, in the interior, I think, design of the current Parliament. Yeah, Barry hadn't built it yet. That was 1820s, wasn't it? Don't know, pass.
Okay,
Margaret's Westminster, a couple of church towers there, isn't there? There's a spire and a tower. I can't see it as well as you, really, from here.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, don't know.
No worries.
Offhand.
I have a question. Sorry. In the last print, there were these rows of objects hanging on the walls. Are they buckets or?
Okay. The last print.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, there were fire buckets on nearly all these structures because everyone was terrified of fire. And a lot of wood there. Sand and water buckets were often just be available to grab off the wall. I imagine that probably is. You still see it, don't you, in some old buildings, or at least, if not the buckets, the pegs where the buckets were hung. That's my best guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just quite like the armaments and stuff on the walls here.
Yes.
It's a nice depiction. It's very sophisticated. That's why it's sort of lithography at its best in some ways. Limestone block. Nice image, yeah. But as I say, the person who sold it wasn't interested in that or anything in the image. But
thank you.
That's my best guess, yeah.
That's what I thought. Thank you.
But not to reach around the world on the internet. Not even I've got the voice to do that. Thank you very much, Jasper. It was really, really excellent. And it's interesting, isn't it, the way that political comment, satire and lampoon weaves its way through all these sorts of things. And the recycling, as you so deftly showed, the recycling of images and slightly changing contexts is really, really masterful. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Okay, I'll just give notice of the next meeting. Our next lecture is on Tuesday, 1st of March at 1 p.m. GMT for our viewers around the world. And it's called The Concealment of Sacred Objects During the English Reformation, Evidence of Piety or Protest by Bruce Watson, FSA. The event will take place here in Piccadilly, as well as online, and please book through the website if you'd like to attend. Our full winter event program is live on our website now, and bookings are open, and all our events are free and open for anyone to join. Thank you very much.